Welcome to U.S. History 1, formerly called by Angelina College History 1301. My name is Kevin Wooten. I'm your instructor for this class. And this class will just generally cover the first half of American history from, as we call it, first contact with the people, with the land in what we now know as the United States. Excuse me, with up through the Civil War and Reconstruction. This first PowerPoint presentation will generally consist of a timeline. It's going to cover a long period of time, up through from the beginning when people first crossed the ocean or the Bering Strait to land on the North American continent, all the way up through the earliest colonial settlements. That's what this first presentation will consist of. About 20,000 to 30,000 years ago, archaeologists, and there's some discussion and there's some controversy in some ways about whether this is true. Of course, nothing can be absolutely proven, something that happened that long ago, but through things like carbon dating and through archaeological evidence, we've been able to determine that about 20,000 to 30,000 years ago, persons from northern Asia, or what we might know now as Russia or China, Siberia, that area, crossed over a land bridge that existed when during the Ice Age, when there was less ice in the ocean, crossed over a land bridge from Asia to um, what is now Alaska, and you can see on the map there in the upper left-hand corner uh, where it says Beringia. That's the Bering Strait, and well, the dry bridge that existed at that time, it was called the Bering Strait, and that is where it is assumed by most historians and archaeologists that, or anthropologists, I guess, that people actually crossed over to what is now North America. Of course, when the Ice Age receded, that water went into the ocean, the water levels rose, and the Bering Strait or that land bridge disappeared, and it's not there today. But at one time, it assumed that it was, and people crossed over at that time. And from there, over thousands of years, they slowly reproduced and migrated southward, first encompassing what is now Canada, of course, then what is now the United States, and on down through Mexico, Central America, and into South America. Now there are alternate theories, but they are not as mainstream as the Beringia theory. Those theories include those from Asia coming over by water, by just tracing the coastline uh, on water from the coast of Asia, like I said, China and Southeast Asia, what is now the Philippines and maybe Vietnam, Korea, and just following the coastline up north and up to Alaska and around and over to the Pacific side of the United States, and they just did it by boat. Others have argued that there were people capable that long ago, and this is a more radical theory, I guess, of crossing the Atlantic Ocean, and there's some evidence that people may have, from many, many years ago in this period, come crossed over from the Atlantic. But the most accepted scientific theory is the Bering Strait theory. Now, those people that crossed over early on in those earliest years, and excuse me, and that migrated southward over thousands of years, they were nomads. They lived a nomadic existence, and they basically followed the food. They followed herds of bison or moose or small animals, whatever it is that they could eat. They followed them a lot. Many of them were fishing cultures, where they lived along the coastlines and they fished, but it was generally a day-to-day existence, and it was very rare or basically non-existent to have permanent settlements year round in the same place because people moved with the weather, with the herds of animals, uh, in small tribes or clans, and they would move around based on seasonal issues. But this all changed dramatically, and our entire human existence really changed dramatically about 1500 to 2000 BC. That's about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, when humans began to cultivate agriculture on a permanent basis, able to produce food out of the ground that they could store and eat year round. And by doing this, it allowed them to not have to follow the food and not have to chase the food. And it transforms the lives of the Native Americans that were living here at the time. Uh, it allowed them to do quite a few things, but mainly it allowed them to stay in one place. It allowed them to grow. And so you see, instead of small clans and tribes migrating around, you see cities forming. And when you have large groups of people, you require more um, advanced forms of government. So you start seeing divisions of labor in the economy, and you start seeing more hierarchical leadership form. Yeah, kings and princes and warriors, uh, leaders such as that, and also people began to specialize in different areas of the economy. There would be some people that would just farm, others would be priests, others would be historians, others would, maybe be teachers, and so by settling into one place, cities began to form. Cultures began to became more advanced, and also people began to sit around and philosophize and ask questions about the world around them. And it's argued that this is the period where people like the Mayans and the Incans and some of these what we know now as advanced early cultures began to take stock of the stars and trace the movements of the stars and create calendars and things like that. When before, when they were nomadic, they didn't have the time to just sit around and think about those things. They were constantly searching for food. So this was a revolutionary period of maybe the most in human history, maybe the most important revolution in human history, as it allowed us to move from nomadic beings to civilized beings. Once the agricultural revolution hit and these humans were settling in, there were a couple of different groups, and for whatever reasons, nobody really knows why, they became much more advanced than some other groups. Uh, some, including probably the most advanced, were the groups from Mexico, uh, Mayans, Toltecs, and Aztecs, who settled in what is now the area around Mexico City, uh, along the Central American Yucatan Peninsula and the Isthmus of Panama. Uh, Also, farther north in what is now the United States, the Anasazi established advanced civilizations in what is Chaco Canyon, or what is now New Mexico. And then the Mississippians as well, the Cahokia people settled around what is now St. Louis. Uh, and then also one last group that was considered a fairly advanced Native American society were the Eastern Woodlands, and they established their dominance along the in the northeast along the eastern seaboard. The Algonquins, the Algonquian speakers, that's their language, and they were the Narragansetts and the Abenaki. Now, while the Mayans and the Anasazi and some of these other groups were establishing themselves and becoming very advanced cultures in what is now the United States and North America, this was just, 1,000 or so years, and right up to the time of 1,000 or so years before, and right up to the time of what we call the Columbian Exchange, or when Columbus reaches what is now the New World, there are other areas of the world that are also developing very advanced cultures, including Africa. West African societies before the discovery of America include the Mali peoples. Right there, you see the yellow on the map, or the gold colored on the map, and it was this Mali area where many of the slaves came from, that came to the East, what is known as the East Indies or the Caribbean islands, and then later, well, they went to Europe as well, but later to the United States through the Caribbean islands. But there were Africa had a very advanced society back then. They had a matriarchal society where people traced their lineage through their mother's side. They did. They had advanced medicine. They had advanced trading routes with not just with but among Africans, but with Europe as well, and into India. So they too were becoming an advanced culture in a different way than the Mayans and the Toltecs and the Aztecs. Along with the North American societies, Native American societies that formed, and the African societies that were forming, we also had, of course, the Western Europe societies that had formed, and these societies were, depending on how you judge societies, were considered, of course, by Western European historians to be the most advanced, but uh, that may not be necessarily so that's up for debate. But pre 1492, of course, which was when Columbus reached the New World, uh, the European societies were slowly coming out of the Dark Ages, slowly coming out of the Middle Ages, which was a an era of anti-intellectualism, an era of mysticism, an era of dominance by the Catholic Church, and quite a few things were happening at this time that led to the decline of these Middle and Dark Ages. First, the rise of commerce, trading. Uh, Many of the uh, most of the society at that time in Western Europe, during the Dark Ages at least, they were feudal estates. You had masters and serfs, and it was like the feudal estate was but the feudal lord was a self-contained economy in and of itself, and there really wasn't a lot of outside contact with other people. Much like the plantation slave economies of the South in the United States, these these lords, feudal lords, would basically have absolute control and rule over their serfs. And but uh, as the Middle Ages declined, that became unworkable. A lot of it had to do with the Black Plague, with the death of many of the not only the serfs but the aristocracy and the lords. Also, you see the need for uh, finished goods that they couldn't provide for themselves. And so the rise of commerce, they began trading not only with one another, but with other nations, and over time, other continents. Also, you had some new monarchs that were more forward-thinking and less controlled by the Catholic Church. During the Middle Ages, all monarchs or all kings and queens only ruled at the whim, really, of the Pope, because the Church had that much control over the societies in Europe at the time. So these new monarchs resisted the uh, the uh, the dictates or the demands of the Pope, and kind of went off on their own at their own peril. It was still a struggle, but they were branching away and moving away from control by the Church and the Pope. And with all this going on, feudalism, the whole system of feudalism, much like the system of slavery in the United States, kind of went away. It became unworkable, and political authority became much more centralized. During the Middle Ages, there wasn't a lot of central political authority. As I said, the feudal lord was basically the lord over his landed estates, and and so they when the feudal estates went away, the power became centralized in political leaders of what we'll call nation states. These disparate feudal states that were scattered all over the place became states or nations, and therefore leaders arose out of these, and power was centralized, and also improving nautical technology, starting with the Vikings, of course, the ability to um, navigate the seas in a safe way, and that was the most important thing. I mean, everybody wanted to cross. Or at least once they figured out that the world wasn't flat, everybody wanted to cross the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean to see what was there. But they didn't know, and they didn't know how far it was, and they didn't necessarily have great navigational skills to know which way they were going. But that improving nautical skills and nautical technology helped helped lead to advanced commerce and more exploration. And then finally, just in general during this period, Renaissance thinking or new thinking, referring back to the classic Greek knowledge of and of course the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, that sucked the life out of all the whole concept of intellectual uh, um, insight or intellectual curiosity. But with the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg, um, I believe, don't quote me on this, 1488. But with that, knowledge became more widespread. There were more books out there, therefore more people learned how to read. More people learned how to read about other parts of the world. Of course, that led to more people reading the Bible, which led to more people challenging church authority. And then classical, as I said, classical knowledge revisited, uh, the curiosity about the world, and the desire to explore and learn new things. All of these were things that were kind of happening just before, at the time that Columbus decided to set sail. Of course, Columbus was a perfect example of all of these things coming together at once. The nautical technology, the curiosity of the world, the monarchs like Isabella and Ferdinand, who financed um, his explorations. As the Middle Ages came to a close, Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain unified the disparate powers in the country and sought to take advantage of this newfound nautical technology, this new inspiration for exploration. And they were approached by a guy named Christopher Columbus, who was an Italian, who was just was an adventurous person who had always wanted and was fascinated with the idea of finding a westward route to India, um, and to the Far East and to China. But he could not get anybody in Italy to finance his trip, but he was able to persuade Isabel and Ferdinand to finance his trip with, of course, his three ships, uh, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, and so he makes, I believe, four trips to the New World. Of course, on the way to what he thought would be China or the Far East, he runs into what we know as North America. And the main places that he explored, he didn't necessarily get on uh, what we now know as the United States, but he explored all the islands of the Caribbean, and began to establish a Spanish presence there. Uh, so that was the first contact, as we say, with from the Europeans with what would be the natives of the Americas: North America, Central America, and South America. Now, this contact between Europeans, Columbus, and then other later explorers, and the natives, led to an exchange. Of course, obviously called the Columbian Exchange, uh, named after Columbus himself. There were many things that the Europeans brought over that the natives of the Americas had never seen, and they took back with them to Europe many things that the Europeans had never seen. Among the things that the Europeans introduced into the New World were bananas, oranges, and sugar, pigs, sheep, and horses. Um, Maybe most importantly, While they did introduce uh, to the Americas plants and animals, diseases was one of the most devastating things that they introduced into the New World. Influenza, typhus, measles, and especially smallpox. And and of course, as we know, the Europeans and the conquistadors completely devastated the populations, the native populations of the Americas. They they wiped out, some statistics say upwards of 90 to 95% of all the natives that had that lived in North America and Central America and even South America during the pre-Columbian period. And it wasn't war or battle that killed most of the natives. It was diseases. They did not have immunities. The natives did not have the same immunities to diseases that the Europeans had. The Europeans were carriers of the influenza virus, the typhus virus, the measles, the smallpox. Yet they didn't get the disease because their immune systems had developed an immunity. But the natives had no such immunities, and their immune systems could not fight these diseases, so they couldn't be carriers. They just simply got the disease, and most of them died. Uh, Weapons were also introduced by the Europeans that the natives hadn't seen before: metal swords, guns, um, and all of these things combined dramatically altered the diet and the way of life for the natives. Now, it took time before these things were filtered into the deepest parts of the Americas. You know, initially all of them were on the coastlines, but over time it radically changed and decimated the natives. Now, the natives uh, introduced certain things to the Europeans that they took back with them that they had not uh, seen before in Europe. Things like maize or corn, squash, tomatoes, and potatoes. Uh, and while as history tells us that the natives were absolutely devastated and almost completely annihilated by the Columbian Exchange. Early on, a lot of the interaction was peaceful. They traded peacefully. They um, would trade goods and have friendly interactions. But over time, when the natives failed to do exactly as the Europeans wanted them to do, specifically converting to Christianity, they were often massacred for their disobedience. Now, when the Spanish, I mean, when the English saw Columbus had discovered the Americas, quote unquote, uh, it piqued their interest, and they didn't want, because there was competition among the empires in Europe, the Spanish Empire, the, the British Empire, the French Empire. England didn't want them to get the foothold. The Great Britain didn't want Spain to get too much of a foothold in the New World, so they sent their own explorations. The first to go, the first English explorer of the New World, of the Americas, was John Cabot in 1497. 1517, Martin Luther begins his protest against the Catholic Church, which leads to the Protestant Reformation. Now, the Protestant Reformation is important because it leads to a break of a group of people, the Protestants, from the existing Anglican Church, uh, and uh, and that break leads these Protestants to kind of become nomads in a way because they are persecuted, and they will eventually find their way to the New World by migrating across the ocean for religious freedom. Then in 1521, Cortez conquers the Aztecs with about 600 men. He conquers a civilization of millions, mainly with superior weapons and the spreading of disease. Also, of course, though, he did play some of the native tribes against each other because there was long-standing disputes between the many different uh, Aztec factions in Mexico, what will be New Mexico at the time, and he was able to play them against each other. 1540, Coronado explores the American Southwest for Spain. He had heard stories of cities of gold and went searching for them. Of course, he didn't find them, but it's just another example of European explorers searching new and deeper parts of the New World. 1585, you have the Roanoke settlement, which was one of the first British settlements uh, in the New World, and it was a Roanoke Island off the coast of North Carolina. And the amazing thing about the Roanoke settlement is that while they established the settlement, the early leaders had to go back for supplies and took their ships for supplies, and they got caught up and they couldn't get back because of wars and other reasons, and they were gone for a few years. And by the time they did get back, the that Roanoke settlement was gone. It had disappeared, and nobody really knows what happened to it. Nobody knows where the people went. Uh, Most think that one of two things happened: either the natives massacred the early settlers at Roanoke, or because of hunger, the early Roanoke settlements moved inland to live with the Indians simply to survive. Uh, and then in 1588, a very pivotal thing happens. The Prior to 1588, the Spanish Navy uh, was considered at least the equivalent, maybe superior to the Navy of Great Britain. And so Spanish, being the earliest settlers, kind of had an advantage in the New World. But in a great battle, the Great Britain defeated the Spanish Armada, or the Spanish Navy, thereby really sweeping away any resistance to their own uh, settling and exploration of the New World, specifically the North American part of the New World. Spanish will, of course, in their time, uh, control South America and Central America, but as far as North America, or what we know as the United States now, that territory, Great Britain is basically now unfettered with the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. Continuing our timeline, and we're just doing a little kind of a rough overview of the events that happened during these early settlement years. 1607 is a um, pivotal year because the first English settlers established Virginia. That's the first real permanent settlement that will have last staying power and will last. They settled at a place called Jamestown, named after King James, and it was a joint. In the group that settled it was a joint stock company. Now, when we go back to the earlier explorers, many of them like Cabot and some of the others, it was they financed the whole thing themselves, and so it was a high risk, high reward kind of venture. You know, if you finance the whole expedition yourself and it was successful, well, you reaped all the profits and became exceptionally wealthy and exceptionally famous. But the downside was, if it failed, you lost everything. And so they came up with this concept of the joint stock company, which is kind of similar to the current corporations that we have now, where you have multiple investors who will all pitch in money, and it spreads the risk out. You end up having enough money to make the expedition, but not one person is going to come to financial ruin if it is not successful, because many people, hundreds if not thousands, have invested in the venture. So that's what the London company was, a joint stock company, and that was the joint stock company that established the Jamestown settlement. Of course, early on there was a lot of problems. Many of these people that came and settled in Jamestown, they were generally middle class. These were not poor people. The early settlers. They were generally middle class professional people, oftentimes lawyers, things like that. Of course, all of them knew how to farm to some extent, but most of them had servants back in indentured servants, uh, which we'll talk about a little bit later, back in Europe. So they were not used to working, but they got here and they just assumed when they settled in Jamestown that they would just round up Indians, and those Indians would work for them, and they would just enslave the Indians without any resistance from them. Well, they were very wrong, and they had a very hard time controlling the Indian population, and the Indians, of course, would not submit to being their slaves, and so that means to eat they had to feed themselves, but nobody wanted to work, and because everybody was not used to working and was used to a comfortable life, and so it was they were near destitute and near starving when Captain John Smith kind of took control and basically laid down the law and said, basically, if you don't work, you don't eat. If you don't help plant, you don't help harvest, you don't eat. And he kind of took control of the settlement and got it back on its feet. But in 1609, 1611, they had one of the worst periods where Smith had, I believe, had gone back to Europe, and they were having a very, very hard time called the Starving Time. And it was here that they finally received some help from the native tribes into helping these settlers survive. Um, also, early on, these first 4 or 5 years, the Virginia settlement, the Jamestown settlement, is a corporation. So their main purpose is to make money, and that there was nothing profitable about this settlement for the first 4 or 5 years. They weren't making any money, and it was becoming very controversial. And many of the investors were considering leaving until John Rolfe discovered that it was you could plant, and nearby was planted a much higher quality tobacco than they had in England, much smoother, uh, and he knew that it would be a market. There would be a market for it in England, so he began to um, plant and harvest and make profitable what they called the stinking weed, or what the natives called the stinking weed, and that made Jamestown profitable and made it a viable venture. A little later, 1613, Peter Stuyvesant established a Dutch explorer establishes New Amsterdam, which will later become New York. 1619, Virginia, that first colony, creates the Virginia House of Burgesses, and they meet for the first time in 1619. And that is an example, the first example of a colonial elected legislature meeting on American soil. It's a pivotal moment as far as the political history of the United States. The Virginia House of Burgesses meeting is the first colonial legislature to meet in American history. Also, that same year is the first records of slaves, African slaves, being sold at Jamestown and on the new in the New World, in the Americas, the mainland Americas, what is now the United States. Of course, there had been slave trading and slaves in the Caribbean islands, but not on mainland North America. In 1619, and there may have been there before 1619, but there was no documentation of it. But 1619 is where the first documented slave trade was established in Jamestown. And then 1620, Plymouth is established, which will later become part of Massachusetts. The Pilgrims, those Protestant refugees, if you will, are cross the seas to establish their settlement, thinking that I believe they're thinking that they're heading towards Virginia, but they're blown off course farther north, and they realize this, and they know they're not under the king's rule because the king had not granted them that charter wherever they landed, and so they knew that they had to establish, without the king's protection, they had to establish some form of rules amongst themselves because they weren't under British rule anymore. So they signed what is called famously now the Mayflower Compact, because it was on the Mayflower, and the compact basically binds the citizens together for their mutual protection and mutual benefit. And it's a kind of social contract, which we'll talk about in government class when you take government, but it's a social contract saying we the people will come together to form a government. Not a hierarchical king down government, but the people coming together to forming a government and making their own rules regarding their own benefit and their own safety. It's a pivotal moment. Here's just a map showing the what we call the Chesapeake Bay area of the New World. You see Jamestown there. That is what is now Virginia, and on up into the Plymouth colony, which will become Massachusetts. This is kind of the northern part, the middle to the northern part of the eastern seaboard of what is now the United States. But those are the two initial major settlements, Jamestown and Plymouth. This shows a map of more specific to New England and the early settlements in New England. As we can see, many of the new settlements become, colonies later, and then states. You have Long Island, which of course is New York. New Haven, which will be kind of divided between New York and New Jersey later on. Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Plymouth will be folded into Massachusetts over time. But it just goes, and then of course Maine up the coastline to the north. Uh, but it just shows these early settlements in this one area, which was very successful in becoming a viable home for many of these new settlers. And all these are from England, these earliest settlers. Most are Protestant, as too. But as we're going to see later, colonies like Maryland will come in, which was kind of a safe haven for Catholics, and of course Pennsylvania for Quakers. 1623, New Hampshire is chartered and established as a commercial venture led by a man named John Mason. And as you look here, you're going to see there are spurts of periods where new colonies are established, and then you're going to have lulls where settlements are not becoming new settlements aren't being established, new colonies aren't being established. But at this point in the 1620s and 30s, there's a wave of colonies and being chartered by the king. 1628, Massachusetts Puritan Refuge, led by John Winthrop. Maryland, the Catholic Refuge that I spoke of just a while ago. Sir George Calvert, later to be named Lord Baltimore. Of course, Baltimore being the major city in Maryland, named after Lord Baltimore. Connecticut in 1635 was just a colony carved out of Massachusetts, established by Thomas Hooker. 1636, Rhode Island is established by religious dissenters who weren't towing the line, if you will, in Massachusetts like the Puritans required. They were a little more religiously tolerant, especially Roger Williams, who was very religiously tolerant. Also, he had a much better relationship with the Native Americans. He actually paid fair market value for Rhode Island from to the natives who had lived there before. He didn't steal them or swindle them out of their land like those that bought Long Island for just basically some beads. But Roger Williams was a very tolerant, he was way ahead of his time as far as that kind of attitude. And then Delaware, 1683, is a commercial venture. Peter Minuit is the leader of that colonial venture. Here's a map of Maryland, that the Catholic Refuge for those that wanted to come to the New World for their own, generally economic benefit, but were not welcome in the existing Protestant Puritan colonies in New England and in settlements in New England, so they established their own. You can see the green is the original land grant to Lord Baltimore, and then the line there is the present day boundary of Maryland, which it's basically the same shape, just smaller, but very similar in shape to the initial grant. Now, many of the events that were happening in the New World were driven by events happening in Europe. And one of the main events that caused issues within England, of course, that spilled over into the Americas, is the Civil War in England, 1625 to 1649. Towards the end of that Civil War, 1649, Charles won. Charles the First is beheaded, and so the crown or the monarchy is toppled, and a more democratic form of government is established in 1649 with Oliver Cromwell governing as the Lord Protectorate. And Cromwell was a very powerful, very strong leader who was able to hold the country together. But once he died, by 1660, the Stuarts were restored to the throne. The Stuart monarchy, of which Charles I was a part, restored to the throne. 1660 to 1685, Charles II rules 1685 to 1688. James II rules, and it's during these times of monarch monarchical rule is when most settlements in the New World were established. There wasn't a lot going on. It was kind of a dead period during the time of Oliver Cromwell as the Lord Protectorate. Then of course, the Stuarts are Catholic. Charles II and James II are both Catholic kings, and of course, there's that always that uncomfortable um, feeling, I guess, that the Protestant settlers, most of course the settlers in the New World are Protestant, have with the Catholic or Anglican um, Church back in England. So they were very happy in the New World and in the Americas when in 1668 we have what's called the Glorious Revolution in England, where Protestants, William and Mary, uh, take the throne, and they see this, that the settlers, especially those in probably all the colonies except um, Maryland, see this as a great thing for the new colonies. Of course, as I mentioned, when the Stuarts were restored to the throne, 1660, you start seeing new colonial ventures established. 1663, the establishment of Carolina, which will be later split between North Carolina and South Carolina. Both are commercial ventures. Uh, Both are established by a man named Anthony Ashley Cooper. 1664, New York is officially chartered by Great Britain after it's basically taken from the Dutch, and its name is changed from New Amsterdam to New York. 1664, New Jersey is established as a Quaker settlement by Sir George Carteret. And then the most famous of the Quaker settlements, Pennsylvania, 1681, is established by William Penn. And then the last of the colonies the original 13 colonies to be established was Georgia, and that was established for generally a different reason than the other colonies. The other colonies were established for one of two purposes, usually as a religious haven for people who were persecuted religiously. Others for commercial reasons. It's either to make money or to protect their religion. Georgia, on the other hand, was established by a guy named James Oglethorpe with much more, I would argue, more inspiring motivation. He saw it as a refuge for kind of the least of society back in England, where people that were had maybe would be end up in debtor's prison, or that somehow ran afoul of the law, or just were just not people who fit into society, as a refuge for them. He had very strict rules, and it was like if you came to Georgia, you had to kind of change your life with a fresh start by following his strict rules. But that was kind of his motivation in establishing the Georgia colony. Now, Great Britain, they didn't care too much about the idea of a charity colony, if you will, but they did see the value of Georgia as a buffer between the established colony of South Carolina and uh, Spanish Florida. They saw this as a very important buffer to protect the economic interests in South Carolina and on up the colonial seaboard along the east coast of what is now the United States, protection from the constant enemy of Great Britain, Spain, which had established Florida as a viable and important colony of their own. And this is a map that just shows Georgia and how it is a buffer to between Spanish Florida and South Carolina. You can see that it provides a huge landmass between the two, and while Great Britain tolerated Oglethorpe's ventures there, they basically only saw it as a good buffer to protect their interests, Great Britain's interests in the Carolinas.